Amidst a chilling winter's night, a homeless woman offers her only coat to a shivering millionaire. But his reaction? It's something no one could have expected. The city of Boston had always been a testament to resilience. Its cobbled streets, weaving tales of both triumph and despair. For Jennifer, a middle-aged homeless woman with a past she rarely spoke of, the biting cold was an all-too-familiar companion. Life had not always been this way. Years ago, she had been an aspiring artist, with dreams of painting her way to a better life. But a series of unfortunate events, a failing economy, personal tragedy, and an eviction had left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to survive. Jennifer's days were spent navigating shelter lines, looking for warm meals, and holding on to the scraps of humanity offered by the city's kind souls. But tonight, the air carried an unforgiving chill that seeped into her bones. Clutching her fraying coat, she wandered the streets, her breath forming clouds against the midnight sky. At the same time, just a few blocks away, Richard Montague, a prominent figure in the financial world, was rushing out of his downtown office. A multi-millionaire with a lifestyle to match, Richard prided himself on his hard-earned success. Yet despite his wealth, there was an emptiness about him that even the most luxurious comforts couldn't fill. As Richard stepped into the icy air, he pulled his cashmere scarf tighter, glancing impatiently at his wristwatch. The world for him was a series of transactions and empire built on numbers and logic, where emotions held no currency. Tonight, however, fate had other plans. Jennifer spotted Richard near a lamppost, his figure partially silhouetted against the light. He appeared out of place amidst the quiet desperation that painted the neighborhood. His expensive attire was a stark contrast to her own tattered layers. For a moment, she hesitated. There was something in the way he stood rigid, almost as if he were battling something unseen, and then she noticed it. His hands trembled, and his face bore a pallor that even the streetlights couldn't mask. He was shivering. Without hesitation, Jennifer walked toward him. She had nothing to offer but the worn coat wrapped around her shoulders. Yet, as she approached, she made a decision that would set the stage for an unforgettable encounter. "Here," she said, holding out the coat. "You need this more than I do." Jennifer's coat was her lifeline. It had shielded her from countless harsh winters, its fabric worn thin yet holding remnants of warmth and memories. Sacrificing it was an act born not of thought but of instinct to care. Even when the world had offered her so little in return, she draped it over Richard's shoulders with a tenderness that spoke of her unbroken spirit, a glimmer of humanity shining through the trials she bore daily. The act was simple, yet profound, the kind of moment that rarely graced Richard's meticulously planned life. Richard, a man of calculated decisions, found himself frozen not by the cold, but by the gesture. To him, kindness was a commodity, often given with the expectation of return. Here stood a stranger, ragged and frail, offering him the very thing that kept her alive on such a merciless night. It was an encounter that defied the transactional nature of his world. As the warmth of the coat seeped into him, Richard was forced to confront a reality far removed from his own. In her silent gesture, he saw a resilience he couldn't fathom, and a selflessness that unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. Jennifer turned back into the shadows of the street, leaving Richard standing in disbelief under the dim glow of a street lamp. Her departure was swift, as if she had already moved past the moment, seeking warmth from the flickering neon sign of a distant shelter. For her, survival was a continuous journey. She didn't linger to witness the ripple her small sacrifice had set into motion. But Richard couldn't move. Something about the encounter gripped him. It was not just the physical warmth of the coat, but the unsettling warmth of an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel: gratitude. He found himself staring after her, the weight of her gift heavier than he expected. That night, Richard returned to his penthouse, a sprawling space of polished steel and glass overlooking the glittering cityscape. Yet, even amidst the opulence, he couldn't shake the image of Jennifer, her gaunt face, her hollowed eyes, and above all, her act of giving. For the first time in years, his mind strayed from contracts and acquisitions to something deeply personal, profoundly human, and it was only the beginning of a series of events that would unravel the tightly woven fabric of his life. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Normally, his mornings began with emails and flasks. The following morning, Richard awoke in his lavish penthouse, sunlight streaming one calls, orchestrating deals that brought him one step closer to greater wealth. But this day was different. His mind was tethered to the previous night, replaying the moment when a homeless woman had selflessly handed him her coat. He shook his head, attempting to dismiss the thought, but it clung to him. He had spent years perfecting a life that insulated him from vulnerability. Yet this encounter had breached his carefully constructed walls. Richard decided to channel his discomfort into action, not because of guilt told himself, but because of curiosity. He instructed his driver to take him back to the same neighborhood. The streets, bustling with the energy of midday, looked different in the light. The contrast between luxury and despair was more jarring. He scanned the sidewalks, his gaze searching for Jennifer. At first, it seemed futile. There were countless figures moving through the city. But then he spotted her, seated near a small community center, her hands cupped around a steaming cup of coffee, likely donated by a kind stranger. Richard observed from a distance, something about her presence compelling him. She wasn't begging or seeking attention. Instead, she exuded a quiet dignity, even as her surroundings betrayed her circumstances. He began to notice the people around her: children with torn shoes, men with weathered faces, women clutching bags that held their entire lives. It was a world he had ignored, yet it now felt uncomfortably close. Later that day, Richard met with his assistant, Evelyn. Efficient and no-nonsense, Evelyn had worked with him for years and knew better than to question his sudden whims. When Richard asked her to gather information about shelters in the city, her raised eyebrow was the only sign of her surprise. He requested specifics, not statistics or reports, but personal stories of those who lived on the streets. Over the next few days, Evelyn's findings painted a vivid picture of a system overwhelmed and underfunded. The shelters were at capacity, with many turning people away as winter deepened. Families were splitting apart, forced to prioritize who could access limited resources. Richard read the reports with an intensity he usually reserved for high-stakes business proposals. It was the first time he considered that wealth could be more than a measure of success. It could be a tool for change. Yet, amidst the numbers and stories, Jennifer remained at the forefront of his thoughts. He learned from Evelyn that the community center where he had seen her provided meals and temporary relief, but lacked the resources for long-term solutions. The people who frequented the center were often ignored by the city, their struggles invisible to those who walked past them daily. On a particularly frigid evening, Richard returned to the community center, blending into the sparse crowd gathered for a hot meal. Jennifer was there, helping distribute food alongside volunteers. Her movements were deliberate and calm, her interaction with others genuine. It became clear to Richard that she wasn't merely a passive recipient of charity. She was actively trying to give back, even when she had so little herself. He left without speaking to her, conflicted about how to approach someone so starkly different from himself. But the seed of an idea had taken root. That night, he drafted a proposal, a plan to fund a new shelter, one that provided not only warmth and food but also programs for skill development and rehabilitation. However, as he stared at the document on his screen, doubt crept in. Was he doing this to absolve himself of the guilt he didn't want to admit? Or was it something deeper, a desire to bridge the chasm between his world and Jennifer's? For the first time, Richard found himself questioning his motivations, a vulnerability he had avoided his entire life. The following week, Richard's plan began to materialize. He worked closely with Evelyn to draft a detailed blueprint for the shelter project, incorporating features designed to offer a pathway out of homelessness. The facility would include workshops for job training, counseling services, and spaces for families to stay together. But despite the tangible progress, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the project needed something more, something personal. One evening, after another long day of meetings and calls, he decided to return to the community center. This time, he brought a donation of winter coats, choosing to distribute them himself rather than delegating the task. As he arrived, the sight of Jennifer once again caught his attention. She was sitting quietly in a corner, speaking with an elderly man whose face bore years of hardship. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the crowded room. Richard approached cautiously, not wanting to disrupt the moment. When their eyes met, Jennifer looked at him with a mixture of recognition and surprise. Though he had anticipated this encounter, he hadn't prepared for the intensity of her gaze. that seemed to pierce through his polished exterior. He handed her one of the coats, his movements deliberate. She hesitated for a moment before accepting it, her expression unreadable. It was a fleeting interaction, but in that instant, Richard felt a connection he couldn't explain. Jennifer's silence carried a weight, as if she were assessing his intentions without the need for words. After distributing the remaining coats, Richard found himself lingering outside the center. The cold air bit at his skin, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were consumed by Jennifer and the reality of her life. He realized that while his shelter project was noble, it lacked a deeper understanding of the people it aimed to serve. Determined to gain insight, Richard requested permission from the community center to spend a day volunteering. The experience was unlike anything he had encountered before. The tasks were mundane, sorting donations, cleaning tables, and serving meals, but the stories he heard were anything but ordinary. Each person he met carried a tale of resilience, loss, and hope. Jennifer, however, remained elusive. She worked tirelessly alongside other volunteers, her focus unwavering. It was clear she had earned their respect, but she revealed little about herself. Richard noticed how others gravitated toward her, seeking her advice or simply sharing a moment of camaraderie. Her quiet strength intrigued him, pushing him further out of his comfort zone. As the day ended, Richard found an opportunity to speak with one of the center's coordinators, a kind woman named Martha. She spoke highly of Jennifer, describing her as a pillar of support for the community. "She doesn't talk much about her past," Martha said, her tone tinged with admiration. "But she's here every day, helping however she can. If anyone deserves a second chance, it's her." Martha's words stayed with Richard as he left the center. For the first time, he began to see Jennifer not just as a symbol of struggle, but as a person with her own story, one he was determined to understand. He returned to his penthouse, his mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, Richard asked Evelyn to arrange a private meeting with Jennifer, offering her a temporary position at his upcoming shelter. It was a bold move, one that he hoped would bridge the gap between their worlds. But as he waited for her response, Richard couldn't ignore the uncertainty gnawing at him. What if she refused? When Jennifer eventually agreed, it marked the beginning of a partnership neither of them could have anticipated. The interaction was brief and formal, yet it carried a spark of potential. For Richard, it was an opportunity to learn from her resilience. For Jennifer, it was a chance to step into a world that had always seemed out of reach. As the shelter project gained momentum, Jennifer became an integral part of its development. Though hesitant at first, she gradually took on more responsibilities, offering valuable insights drawn from her experiences. Her contributions ranged from suggesting practical layout changes to ensuring that the programs addressed the unique challenges faced by those on the streets. For Richard, working alongside Jennifer was an eye-opening experience. Her ability to empathize with others, coupled with her unwavering determination, challenged his perceptions. What had started as a philanthropic endeavor to ease his conscience had evolved into a deeply personal mission. Jennifer's involvement gave the project authenticity, transforming it from a cold, calculated plan into a haven of hope. But not everyone shared their vision. A group of wealthy investors, initially supportive of Richard's idea, began to question the practicality of certain aspects of the shelter. They viewed Jennifer's input as sentimental and impractical, believing the focus should be on efficiency rather than compassion. During a heated board meeting, one investor voiced his concerns bluntly. "This shelter isn't a charity project. It's an investment in the city's image," he argued. "If we cater too much to emotions, we risk failure." Richard sat silently as the words echoed in the room. The man's sentiment reflected the very mindset Richard had once embraced, a mindset that now felt foreign. Glancing at Jennifer, who had joined the meeting as an observer, he saw the hurt in her eyes. She had heard these dismissive attitudes before, and they had only reinforced the barriers that kept people like her invisible. The tension reached a boiling point when another investor proposed scaling back the shelter's programs to cut costs. Richard, who rarely allowed emotions to influence his decisions, found himself unable to remain passive. He stood, his voice steady but firm, and defended the vision they had built together. "This isn't just about numbers," he said. "It's about restoring dignity to lives that have been overlooked for too long. If we lose sight of that, we've already failed." The confrontation marked a turning point for Richard. He realized that supporting Jennifer's vision wasn't just an act of charity. It was a commitment to redefining what success meant in his life. While some investors withdrew their funding, others rallied behind him, inspired by his newfound conviction. Meanwhile, Jennifer continued her work at the shelter, her quiet leadership drawing more people into the fold. She became a source of inspiration for the staff and volunteers, many of whom had their own struggles. For the first time in years, she began to feel a sense of belonging, though she never allowed herself to forget the fragility of her situation. Richard, determined to learn more about Jennifer's past, approached her one evening as she reviewed supply inventories. He asked her to share her story not out of curiosity, but out of respect for the strength that had brought her to this point. At first, Jennifer hesitated, her guard instinctively rising, but something in Richard's demeanor, sincerity she hadn't seen before, prompted her to open up. She spoke of her early life as a promising artist, the years spent dreaming of a career that would allow her to escape poverty. She described how personal tragedy and a series of misfortunes had left her with nothing, forcing her onto the streets. Despite the pain in her voice, there was no trace of bitterness, only a quiet acceptance of the hand she had been dealt. For Richard, hearing Jennifer's story was both humbling and transformative. He saw in her a reflection of the resilience he had spent his life overlooking. Her journey illuminated the stark differences between their worlds, yet it also revealed the common threads that connected them. The shelter's opening day was fast approaching, and the pressure to succeed weighed heavily on both of them. Yet amid the challenges, a sense of purpose united their efforts. For Richard, the project had become more than a venture. It was a chance to create something meaningful. Inspired by Jennifer's unwavering belief in second chances, the grand opening of the shelter loomed, and the days leading up to it were a whirlwind of activity. Volunteers and staff worked tirelessly to ensure that everything was ready, from the layout of the living quarters to the launch of the first skills training programs. Jennifer was at the center of it all, her presence both calming and motivating for those around her. Despite the mounting challenges, she carried herself with quiet determination. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, she grappled with doubts. Could the shelter truly make a difference in a city so accustomed to ignoring its most vulnerable? Would the voices of skepticism drown out the collective hope that had fueled their efforts? For Richard, these doubts mirrored his own. Though he had poured his resources and time into the shelter, he knew that its success depended on something far less tangible than money or logistics. It required trust. Trust in Jennifer, in the team they had built, and most importantly, in the people they sought to help. On the eve of the opening, Richard called a team meeting. The group gathered in the shelter's modest conference room, their faces a mix of anticipation and exhaustion. As they reviewed final preparations, Richard found himself looking at Jennifer, who sat quietly at the edge of the room. It struck him how far they had come not just in building the shelter, but in bridging the gap between their lives. He stood, addressing the room with a tone that was uncharacteristically personal. "This shelter isn't just a place to sleep or eat," he said. "It's a place to rebuild, to rediscover hope. Every one of you has contributed to that vision, and tomorrow, we show the world what compassion can achieve." The applause that followed was brief but genuine, a shared acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. The next morning, the shelter's opening drew a modest crowd. Media outlets arrived, their cameras capturing the ribbon-cutting ceremony and interviews with staff and volunteers. Among the attendees were former skeptics, curious to see how the project had materialized. But what truly mattered were the people who walked through the doors not as spectators, but as individuals seeking help. Jennifer stood near the entrance, welcoming each person with a warm smile. It was a small gesture, but one that conveyed the shelter's mission far better than any speech could. Many recognized her from the community center and the streets, their faces lighting up at the sight of someone who understood their struggles firsthand. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Families found relief in the warmth of the living quarters, while others explored the training rooms and counseling areas. One corner of the shelter had been transformed into an art space, a suggestion from Jennifer, who believed in the healing power of creativity. As the day unfolded, Richard observed from a distance, his heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. Yet, he knew this was only the beginning. The true measure of the shelter's success would come not in the accolades, but in the lives it touched and transformed. Toward the end of the day, an elderly man approached Jennifer, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. His hands trembled as he handed them to her, his voice cracking as he expressed his gratitude. "I never thought I'd see a place like this," he said. "You've given us hope." Jennifer's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she accepted the flowers, her usual composure momentarily giving way to emotion. Richard watched the interaction, feeling an overwhelming mix of pride and humility. It was a moment that encapsulated everything they had worked for, a testament to the power of empathy and perseverance. As the sun set, casting a golden hue over the city, Richard and Jennifer stood side by side at the shelter's entrance. The crowd had thinned, but the air was thick with possibility. For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of fulfillment that no business deal had ever given him. And for Jennifer, the shelter represented more than a second chance. It was a reminder that even in the harshest of winters, humanity could still find warmth. In the weeks following the shelter's opening, the project began to flourish in ways Richard and Jennifer had only hoped for. More people arrived each day, seeking not only warmth and food, but also the chance to rebuild their lives. The job training workshops filled quickly, with local companies offering placements for those who completed their programs. Richard found himself spending more time at the shelter than at his office. For someone who had once thrived in boardrooms, this change surprised him. But here, among people seeking second chances, he discovered a deeper purpose that wealth alone could never provide. The quiet moments watching a family reunite, seeing someone land their first job became more fulfilling than any financial success. Jennifer, too, found herself growing in unexpected ways. The respect and gratitude from those she helped filled a void she had carried for years. She began leading support groups, using her own story of hardship to inspire others. Though her past remained a part of her, it no longer defined her. Instead, it became a source of strength, a reminder of how far she had come. One afternoon, Richard and Jennifer met to review the shelter's first-month performance reports. The numbers were promising, but what stood out were the personal stories of transformation. A young mother who had found work and housing, a former veteran who now mentored others, and countless children who laughed and played freely within the shelter's safe walls. "It's working," Jennifer said softly, a smile breaking across her face. Richard nodded. "Because of you," he replied, his voice tinged with sincerity. Despite the shelter's success, challenges remained. Funding was always a concern, and there were moments when the staff felt stretched thin. But the spirit of the place remained unbroken, thanks to the leadership that Jennifer and Richard had fostered. One evening, as a winter storm swept across the city, a power outage plunged the shelter into darkness. For a brief moment, panic rippled through the rooms. But Jennifer, calm and composed, rallied the staff to light lanterns and distribute blankets. Her steady presence reassured everyone, and soon the shelter was filled with soft, flickering light. Richard watched as she moved among the residents, offering words of comfort. It was in these moments, unplanned, unglamorous, that her true strength shone. The storm outside howled, but inside the shelter, warmth and security prevailed. Later that night, as the storm subsided and the power returned, Richard found Jennifer sitting in the art room, gazing at a canvas one of the children had painted. It was a simple depiction of a house bathed in golden light, surrounded by smiling figures. "Home," Jennifer said quietly, as if speaking to herself. Richard sat beside her, the weight of their journey settling over him. "That's what we've built," he said. Jennifer nodded, her eyes misty. "And it's only the beginning." As they sat in companionable silence, Richard realized that this moment wasn't just the culmination of a project. It was the beginning of something deeper, a shared mission, a partnership forged not by wealth or the shelter became a beacon of hope for the community. Word spread, and more people arrived each week, seeking not only aid but also inspiration. Jennifer and Richard became symbols of the shelter's success, their partnership demonstrating the power of unlikely alliances. The art room, an idea that Jennifer had hesitated to suggest, blossomed into one of the most beloved spaces in the shelter. Residents poured their emotions into paintings, sketches, and crafts, finding solace in creativity. One afternoon, a young girl approached Jennifer with a drawing of a tree, its branches reaching toward the sky, covered in blossoms. "It's you," the girl said shyly, her small fingers pointing to the sturdy trunk. "You help us grow." Jennifer was struck by the child's words, their simplicity carrying profound meaning. For so long she had been defined by what she lacked, yet here she was, seen as a source of strength. It was a moment she carried with her, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave lasting impressions. Meanwhile, Richard continued to explore how his resources could expand the shelter's reach. He worked to secure additional funding, reaching out to contacts who had initially doubted the project. His newfound passion was evident in every conversation, his conviction persuading even the most skeptical donors. As the harsh winter gave way to the first signs of spring, the shelter's impact became undeniable. Families who had once entered its doors with nothing now had stories of triumph, new jobs, permanent housing, and restored dignity. The community began to rally around the shelter, offering donations and volunteer hours in a show of solidarity. One evening, as the staff gathered to celebrate the shelter's 3-month milestone, Richard stood to speak. His words were simple but heartfelt, expressing gratitude for the people who had made the shelter a reality. He acknowledged Jennifer, whose unwavering determination had inspired him to change his perspective on life. Jennifer, though reluctant to step into the spotlight, shared her own reflections. She spoke not of herself, but of the countless people who had walked through the shelter's doors, each carrying their own story of resilience. Her voice carried the same quiet strength that had defined her journey, leaving the room in thoughtful silence. As the evening drew to a close, Richard and Jennifer found themselves alone on the shelter's rooftop, the city lights stretching out before them. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding of how far they had come. "This isn't the end," Richard said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No," Jennifer replied, her voice steady. "It's just the beginning." And as the stars began to pierce the night sky, they both knew that the shelter was more than a building. It was a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and the unexpected connections that could transform lives. Months passed, and the shelter continued to grow, not just in size but in influence. It became a symbol of change within the city, a place where people could find more than temporary relief. They could find purpose. Its success began to inspire similar projects in neighboring areas, creating a ripple effect of compassion and action. Jennifer's life also transformed in profound ways. For years, she had viewed herself as a survivor, focused solely on enduring the day-to-day struggles of homelessness. But now she was a leader, her story resonating with others who had walked the same path. She began speaking at events, sharing her journey to encourage empathy and action. Through her role at the shelter, she reconnected with her love for art. In the evenings, she would stay late in the art room, painting pieces that reflected her newfound hope. Her work began to attract attention, and soon, an art gallery offered to host an exhibition featuring her creations. The proceeds, she insisted, would go directly to the shelter. Richard's transformation was equally profound. He no longer defined his success by the size of his portfolio or the luxury of his lifestyle. Instead, he measured it in the smiles of those the shelter had helped, in the laughter that now filled its halls. He continued to use his influence to advocate for the homeless, pushing for policy changes and increased funding for shelters across the city. Despite their achievements, both Jennifer and Richard understood that their work was far from over. Homelessness was a complex issue, and the shelter, while impactful, was only one piece of the puzzle. Together, they brainstormed ways to expand their efforts, exploring initiatives like affordable housing programs and partnerships with local businesses to create more job opportunities. Their collaboration deepened into a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. While their lives had started in vastly different worlds, they had found common ground in their commitment to making a difference. Their bond became a source of strength, a reminder that even the unlikeliest connections could lead to extraordinary outcomes. As the first anniversary of the shelter approached, Jennifer and Richard organized a celebration to honor the residents and staff who had made its success possible. The event was simple but heartfelt, featuring speeches, music, and an exhibition of artwork created by the shelter's residents. Jennifer's own paintings took center stage, each piece telling a story of resilience and hope. That evening, as the event came to a close, Richard reflected on how much his life had changed. The man who had once walked through life with a heart guarded by wealth and pride now felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Jennifer, standing beside him, shared his quiet joy, knowing that their work was a testament to the power of humanity's capacity to heal and rebuild. As the shelter's first year came to a close, its impact resonated beyond the city's borders. Media outlets began to cover its story, showcasing it as a blueprint for addressing homelessness with compassion and innovation. Requests for advice and partnerships poured in from other communities, eager to replicate its success. Jennifer's art exhibition became a turning point not just for the shelter but for her as well. The painting sold quickly, raising significant funds for expansion projects. More importantly, the art connected her story to countless others, inspiring donors and volunteers who saw in her work a reflection of their own dreams and struggles. One of her most notable pieces, a painting of a fragile yet resilient tree growing through concrete, became the symbol of the shelter's mission. Richard commissioned replicas to hang in every room of the building, a reminder to all who entered that growth and hope could thrive even in the harshest conditions. Meanwhile, Richard found himself speaking at conferences and policy forums, advocating for systemic change. His transformation from a detached businessman to a compassionate leader earned him respect and admiration. Though he often redirected praise to Jennifer and the team, for both of them, the shelter had become more than a project. It was a testament to what could be achieved when individuals chose to look beyond their differences and work together for a common cause. The final chapter of the shelter's first year was marked by a quiet yet poignant moment. One evening, after the building had emptied of visitors, Richard and Jennifer stood in the courtyard, gazing at the illuminated sign bearing the shelter's name. Beneath it was a newly added plaque inscribed with the words, "A place where humanity meets hope." For Richard, the moment represented a culmination of his personal journey. A man once driven by wealth and ambition now found peace in giving back. The life he had built, once empty despite its opulence, now felt full and meaningful. For Jennifer, the plaque symbolized something equally profound: the realization that her past struggles had not been in vain. They had shaped her into someone capable of creating change, of giving others the second chance she had once longed for. As the two stood in silence, the distant hum of the city surrounding them, Richard finally spoke. "Do you ever think about where we were a year ago?" Jennifer smiled, her gaze steady. "All the time. And it reminds me of what's possible when we choose to believe in each other." The shelter, now a cornerstone of the community, stood as a testament to their journey. It was proof that resilience, compassion, and the courage to act could transform even the bleakest circumstances into a beacon of hope. And while their work was far from over, both Jennifer and Richard knew they had built something extraordinary, a foundation for countless stories yet to unfold.